Okay.
This is a 9-footer. I understand they came in different sizes to accommodate the women and the children. But this was and is an authentic cotton sack, and it was the longest one produced. It was produced 9 feet. And this is how our ancestors worked from what they called can to can't. From can't see in the morning till can't see at night. And they would be going along. I never did this myself, so I can't claim any authenticity, but I know that this is how they wore the sack, and they were bending down all day, picking that cotton, which I understand is kind of thorny, and it can hurt, you know, if you don't know what you're doing. And very often, these sacks had to be filled 3 times a day, and at the end of the day, the cotton picker would get $1 for his day's work. And yet, out of labor like that, our people managed to accumulate and to save and to buy land, to work their own land. In 1865, after the Civil War, right after the Civil War ended, in 1865, black people throughout the country were almost totally illiterate. There were 1 or 2, 3 or 4, a half dozen or so people who could read, but by and large the whole population of blacks were illiterate because they didn't go to school, weren't allowed to go to school, didn't learn how to read or write. So that was in 1865. Yet in 1930, so that would have been 65.
25 years.
19,
years.
more than that. It would 1865 to 1900 would have been 35, right?
80s, right.
Right, and then 30 more years.
65.
It would be 65 years. Now, keep in mind, I'm 70. Okay, so in 65 years, 5 years less than I have been alive, black people turned almost completely around. And by 1930, fully 85% of blacks in this country knew how to read and write. That's amazing. In 65 years, less time than I have been alive, because they valued reading and writing. I don't mean, you know, that they could read Shakespeare or anything like that. Most older people wanted 2 things. They wanted to learn how to read their Bible, and they wanted to be able to read a letter from their child. And so the literacy may not have been very extensive, but it was very expansive. It included almost everybody, because there was nobody that was too old and very few who were too young to go to school. They wanted to read that badly. So from 1865 to 1930, in that short space of time, we went from being an almost totally illiterate people to between 85 and 90% of the people being literate. That's amazing. But you have some idea of how valuable education was to our people. This is Dr. Jane Ellen McAllister, and Dr. McAllister was the first black PhD in education in the world. Lived right across the street. Now, she wasn't the first PhD ever. I think she was the 12th or 13th. There were 12, I think, before her. But she was the first one to gain that PhD in education in 1929, when the Great Depression was on. And in New York, she went to Columbia, attended Columbia, and supported herself by walking the rich people's dogs on Fifth Avenue and Park Avenue. And stay right there. And she received her degree in 1929, and she gave it to us. Isn't that wonderful? The Doctor of Philosophy degree, the first black in the world, man or woman, to receive her PhD in education. Yes, that was Dr. McAllister, and in that picture, she's reading a letter from Booker T. Washington to her parents, because when Booker T. Washington came to Vicksburg in 1905, he stayed at their house, and he wrote a letter, and that letter is what she is reading in that picture. When she had her 96th birthday, which turned out to be her last, it was in this house. We didn't have as many things in the house then as we do now, but we had a lot, and there were 50 or 60 people, maybe more than that, crowded into this house to sing happy birthday and wish her happy birthday greetings. We have some pictures of that party that I will show you. Bill Clinton was president at that time, and so we sent him an invitation to come to the party. He couldn't make it, but he sent a letter of acknowledgement and congratulations to Dr. McAllister, who gave it to us. So Bill and Hillary were not here that day. This is a chair, the most comfortable chair you will probably ever sit in, that was about to be thrown away, and we rescued it from the house where the first black lawyer in Vicksburg lived. His name was T.G. Ewing, and he practiced law at the turn of the century, when of course black lawyers were few and far between. That doesn't even describe how rare they were. And at a time when a black lawyer, if he was representing you, he'd have to prepare your case, give it to the white lawyer, who would appear before the judge, who would make the decision, who would give the decision to the white lawyer, and the white lawyer had to give it back to lawyer Ewing. If you can imagine such idiocy. But yet, we're talking about 100 years ago, which is like a spit in history. You know, it's no time at all. But this was lawyer Ewing's chair, the chair that sat in his living room. This picture is a picture of Dr. Lemuel Bowie, Mrs. Myrtle Bowie's son. Now, Mrs. Myrtle Bowie is still living today. I think she's about 96 years old. Still living right down there on Adams Street. And her son, Lemuel, went to St. Mary's Catholic School, then Howard University, got his master's and his PhD degree from Johns Hopkins University, and became, even to this day, the only scientist who was ever head of the pathology laboratories at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. He headed all of those laboratories without being an MD. He was a PhD, but he was not an MD. And usually an MD is a requirement for that position. He was so brilliant, and they wanted him so much, that he was the leader of research at their laboratories, which are probably the most distinguished in the country. The labs at Northwestern University, which turns out top medical doctors year after year, and Johns Hopkins. Lemmy was also a pilot, had his own plane, and he would fly home and pick up his mom, and they would go together to medical conferences or wherever all over the country. Dr. Bowie died on Christmas Day in 1998, and he has one brother, Eddie Bowie, who lives in California, Miss Myrtle Bowie, who I think is out in California right now, visiting her other son, and Lemmy's wife, and two children who are still living in Evanston, I believe, if the children have not moved away. But just an extraordinary man, grew up right here in little old Vicksburg, Mississippi. And that's why, we don't emphasize the slavery aspect so much because the accomplishments of blacks have been so many. Here is a picture of Patrick Kelly. Patrick Kelly, who is buried in Paris. He died in 1990, and of course he was a world-famous fashion designer. He grew up here in Vicksburg. His mother and grandmother taught him how to sew, and he became better at it than they were. And many women, a little younger than I am, still have gowns that he made for them in high school and for the prom. And when he had done all that he could do here, he decided that he was going to go to Atlanta. Went there, became very well known, and left there, and the only other world to conquer was Paris. So he went to Paris, became immensely successful. Probably his most famous client was Princess Diana, Charles's ex-wife. The deceased wife. That's what I was struggling for. I understand that they were very close. Whenever you saw Diana wearing those dresses with the big bows and buttons, those were Patrick's designs. And she used to call him homie. And Patrick designed for her, for many movie stars, made all of the top fashion magazines, won top fashion awards. We have some of his material here in the house that his grandmother has passed on to us. Just incredible things. This is a picture of my good friend, Dr. Betty Gardner. Dr. Betty Gardner is Dr. McAllister's cousin. And when I told you a little while ago that I grew up in Dr. McAllister's house, it was Bet and I who did that because we used to play over there from the time we were little children until, I don't know, we were too big to fit into all of those crawl spaces in that house. But Betty went on, she got her undergraduate degree at Howard and her master's and her PhD from George Washington University, and she's now professor of history at Coppin State University in Baltimore, Maryland, where she has held many top administrative positions, and she was very good friends with the late Dr. John Hope Franklin and knew him very well. So there's no end to the history that we have here. This, believe it or not, and every time I come in here and I look at this, I want to jump over into that basket. Dorothy Whitley, Tillman's wife, made this out of wallpaper samples. Those are wallpaper samples that she put together in that combination and in those tones and in that symmetry to create the most beautiful basket I have ever seen in my life. Now, who else but a gifted artist would be able to see the potential in wallpaper samples and do something like that with it? A little later on today, I'm going to go down Highway 61. The artist here called me up and told me he had done an oil painting, his first oil. He said that he had done in a long time. And he said, I want you to come down and see it. So this afternoon, 4 o'clock, I'm going to go down and see Verdi Thomas's oil painting. But I have to tell you the story of this. For years, Verdi's primary work was in wood burning. It's a genre that's pretty well lost now. Not many people work in it. But he takes wood, treats it, prepares it, and burns the images into the wood. This is based on a picture that Verdi saw here at the Jacqueline House when we soon opened, early when we had opened. And Verdi looked at the picture and he said, this is every black woman who's ever had to make do. Apparently, this woman had her utilities cut off, and a church group had come to bring some food and other things that the family needed, and one of the members of the group took this picture of her she had built a cook fire on the ground outside the house, and she was making dinner for her husband and children. And everything that was in that picture, Verdi has put into this wood burning. Here is her pocketbook here that she had on the ground, and the flames from the fire, and she was barefoot. And here is the lid to the skillet that she had lifted off, and I guess was checking its doneness or getting ready to do some seasoning. A pile of lumber behind. Her husband worked in lumber, in cutting lumber. And as I say, Verdi said, this is the image of every black woman who's ever had to make a Jew. And I remember one time I had a group of little children in here, about first grade or so, and I was trying to be gentle with them and tell them about how harsh life can be without really telling them, you know. And so I told them very quietly, you know, that sometimes when we can't pay our bills, the folks who own the gas and the water and all of that, they'll turn it off. And all of a sudden, all these little hands went, oh, that happened to my mama last week. Yeah, they turned off our TV. They, you know, these children, these kids at age 6 could relate to this totally because they had already had that experience. And if they had been older, if they had been teenagers, they would have never said that out loud because they would have been ashamed to. But at 6, hey, that happened to my mama. They turned off our TV, so they knew. But Verdi worked on this for several months, and truthfully, I had forgotten that he had the picture. And then, I don't know, about 3 months later, he brought the picture back in this to give to the Jacqueline House. This house is just extraordinary. It's really, in every way, and the stories are endless. I'm just going to set this right here. These are some of our local folk. Holmes, Bill Holmes, was probably, undoubtedly, the best photographer that Vicksburg has ever had. And of course he was black. This picture was taken in the 1940s, long before there was, you know, point and shoot technology that automatically fixed your focus, and of course we didn't have fast speed film. But if you look at her image in the mirror, it's as clear as the actual image here that he took. So you know the boy had to know what he was doing. His name was William Holmes, and he took a tremendous number of photographs in and around Vicksburg, but this one is my favorite. Percy Struthers knows who this is. If you run into Percy sometimes, ask him who the lady in the mirror is. Actually, I think that was his girlfriend for a while.
Percy Struthers is our relative.
Is that right?
Yes.
Ask Percy about this.
Okay.
Ask Percy. He'll tell you. This is, oh gosh, Hattie, I can't even see what her last name is, but if you've ever watched the program Becker on television, the woman who plays the nurse, Margaret, this is she. She has roots here in Vicksburg, and as a matter of fact, helped the Pampley family, I understand, restore the house across the street, which was originally the house of Dr. Horatio Irvin, who was the only black female doctor, black or white, in town. And whites had to come to him too, but they didn't want to use the same entrances that black women did. So black women would go in the front door and whites would go into the side door in the house across the street. That was Dr. Irving's house and the place where he practiced. Here's a younger picture of Dr. McAllister. And of course, Louis Armstrong, who came to the Blue Room together with names that were not all that well known then, but have since become world famous. Here's Louis down here. I regret that a day or so ago, I don't regret it, a white professor by the name of Selby Parker had heard that we had some material on Tom Wentz. He was researching an article on Tom Wentz. So he came here, and I showed him the big notebook of original material, some in Tom's on, blew his mind. So I let him take it with him to research the article for a week. Don't worry, I know where to find him. And he's supposed to have it back to us by Friday. And we'll reference, of course, the Jacqueline House as the owner of this collection. But a big pack of pictures of Tom's wives, of his entertainers. Oh gosh, everybody came down here and played and sang. And he said that it would always take him all the next day to count the money he had made the night before when Louis Armstrong came to play. And the Blue Room, which is now the parking garage of Horizon Casino, that will break your heart. That's where it was. That was the place to be here in Vicksburg, and it was probably the first publicly integrated place in Vicksburg. Whites came, even though it was a black establishment, because the music was too good and they couldn't stay away. So, they just got out on the floor and jitterbugged their versions, I guess, just like everybody else. But whether it was entertainment, whether it was education, whether it was the military, post-Civil War, whether it was education, I said that, but I'm thinking about pictures. We want to go back in this room and take a look at the history of education that we have there, whether it was the Great Migration North. In 1927, there was the Great Flood. The Mississippi overflowed its banks. And when John Barry, who wrote the book about the Great Flood, when he came to Vicksburg some years ago, some friends and I went to hear him talk about the Great Flood. We didn't know anything about the Great Flood. We thought we didn't know anything about the Great Flood. So he was talking, and the more he talked, the more I seemed to know what it was that he was talking about. So, I hit my friend Joyce Gordon, and I said, Joyce, I said, you know what this man is talking about? She said, yeah, talking about the Great Flood. I said, he's talking about the high water. And Joyce said, oh, go on, girlie, man ain't talking about no high water. I said, yes, he is. Now, Joyce knew what the high water was, and I knew what the high water was. And I would think, maybe not all, because there were some blacks who were younger, but those who were our age and a little younger, our parents never called the Great Flood the Great Flood. They called it the high water. That's right. And to this day, if I'm arranging a funeral, I can tell how old a person is, because that person will come in and say, well, now let's see. Oh, yeah, he was born the year of the high water. They won't say 1927. They'll say 1926. They'll say 1928. But anything that happened in 1927, they say was the high water. And that's what we learned. We would sit out on that porch in the evening, my friends and I, and you all had to be back home before 9 o'clock. You had to be sitting on the porch, not rounding the corner. You had to be on the porch at 9 o'clock. And, we would be playing at one another's house, and would come to be about 8:30 or 8:40 or so, and you would ask your parents, you would ask them if you could go peace away. Now, nobody uses that phrase anymore. Nobody even knows what it means. But to my generation, peace away meant if your friends lived, say, 6 blocks from here, and you wanted to go peace away with them, you'd go 3 blocks with them, and then turn around and come back home. So we would all ask, can we go peace away? And the old folks used to say, all right, now, you better be back on this porch at 9 o'clock. And everybody got back home before 9 o'clock. But that was, I remember those 2 phrases distinctly because the old folks talked about what happened in 1927, and they always called it the high water. And of course, Herbert Hoover, who became President of the United States, was the chief engineer in charge of rescuing the people who had been deluged. But he rescued whites first and primarily, and as a result left many, many hundreds and even thousands of blacks to die needlessly waiting for rescue while whites were taken to the high ground. And that is when the political evolution in this country shifted sharply to the left, to FDR, and after the high water in 1927. Because prior to then, most blacks were Republican. They were Republican if for no other reason than they were still grateful to Abraham Lincoln for freeing the slaves. They were Republican, and they stayed Republican. And you had, the Black and the Tan, which was a Republican group. You had George Schuyler in the Pittsburgh Courier presenting a very conservative view, both domestic and internationally. Schuyler was a black scholar who had grown up poor and was a very penetrating and widely read journalist by blacks, even when I was growing up. And so you had blacks who were primarily allied with the Republican Party. But the high water was what changed. And after the high water, people began to experience the expressions of concern on the part of FDR and the actions of Eleanor Roosevelt, in resigning from the Daughters of the American Revolution when they wouldn't let Marian Anderson sing and all such things as that. Blacks became totally identified with the Democratic Party and remain such to this day.
She had a lot to do with the Tuskegee Airmen, too.
Yes, exactly.
And I've heard my mother say she was born a year to high water. She told that to Buddy Green, and I didn't know what it was until you just said something today.
Is that right?
And she was born in 1927.
1927.
Yeah.
That's right. And so, see, Justice, as you could not have made that connection because no one had ever told you, the younger people much younger than you, will never know that because no one has...
And if I hadn't came here today, I would have never known that connection.
Never have known that connection.
Mm-hmm.
But they sat on the porch, and of course we listened to their conversations, and especially during school time, of course, you had to be in bed by 9 o'clock. And one of the things that makes me very sad for children nowadays is that they do not and they will never have the experience of falling asleep listening to the sound of the grown-ups talking. They would come into the house, and when the children were in bed, they would go back in the kitchen. Usually your grandparents were always around, or, family visiting from somewhere. And they'd go back, sit down. They would go back in the kitchen, and they would make coffee and maybe come into the living room, and, they would be talking about World War II and what Jackie had done today on the Brooklyn Dodgers and Haile Selassie and this boy, Lloyd Clay, who had gotten lynched right up here on the corner of Clay and Farmer Streets. Many times you couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was just so comforting to hear the voices of
Someone got lynched in Vicksburg on Clay Street?
Oh yeah, lots of people did.
Okay.
This young man, I've known that story all my life because there were some things, that the old folks didn't want you to know. They didn't want you to hear, or they didn't want you to know. And they had ways of doing that. Especially I think if some girl had gotten pregnant out of wedlock, they would say, so-and-so's daughter got bigged, and all of the little ears would be perking up because we were at the age, when we were interested in such things, and they knew when to be quiet, and they would sit on the front porch, and they'd go like this, they'd go, Child, you don't say. Do tell. Lord Jesus. And you'd be sitting there they knew what they were talking about. We couldn't figure it out. And then after we, had gone to bed and we were in our rooms and so on and settled in, they would talk more entirely among themselves. But one story that my parents and grandparents never tried to keep from me was the lynching of Lloyd Clay. And that happened in 1919. So it was just a little more than 20 years before I was born. And they talked about that often. But he was a young black boy. He was about 18 or 19 years old. And he was a stutterer. And would stutter very badly when he got all excited. And this girl had been on Clay Street, had been sleeping with her boyfriend, I guess, was. And she needed an excuse. And this boy happened to be passing by. His name was Lloyd Clay. And she accused him of raping her. And without trying to determine her truthfulness or anything, a mob gathered, and Lloyd was trying to explain his situation, and he was just stuttering and got all worse. They got a rope and ran him up a tree and lynched him and burned him. And they would not release his body to his mother, even after it had been badly burned. They released it to Fisher Funeral Home down on Cherry Street. And Fisher buried the boy. I've forgotten where. Maybe at the city cemetery. But they have the records at Fisher Funeral Home of this boy. And the lynching took place in 1919. Right? So that was a story that I knew about all of my life. I didn't know, what terms like rape meant, but the grown folks would say, they said that boy did something very bad to that girl, and he didn't do it. He didn't do it.
Any relationship from the name of the street? Is that why it was? Okay, I was just wondering.
Not
Okay.
at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Then again, who knows? There may be. I mean, the man that they named the street after may have had some relation to the boy. We don't know, but there's no direct connection or relation that we know about.
Okay.
We do know, however, that the man who designed the old courthouse was black. And I'm not talking about a foreman or someone a black who was the supervisor of other blacks, but it is actually being documented in print that John Jackson designed the old courthouse museum up here in Vicksburg. So as I say that, the stories are they are endless. They are endless. Vicksburg at one time owned land north of the city and adjacent to the city that we'll never get back again. But we owned it. We owned it. And then, folks came along and waved a couple of $100 bills in the face of some people, and they could get new cars, and they gave up 5, 10, 20, 100 acres of very precious land. We'll never get that land back. We'll never get that land back. After the Civil War, we owned most of the land around Vicksburg. Most of the land. In fact, you all know about Little Black Sambo? That was sort of a nursery rhyme for children, and Little Black Sambo was this cartoon character of black people, you know, and he couldn't talk right, and you know, did all of the things that whites said blacks did stereotypically. And they called him Little Black Sambo. That cultural stereotype came out of white resistance to the fact that blacks owned most of the businesses in town, in Washington Street. Dr. Penson and his son had a clinic down on Washington Street. Nobody knows that anymore. They had a drugstore down there. The bank for the Freedmen's Bank, I think the vault is still in that store downtown. A lot of restaurants downtown. Blacks owned Vicksburg the early part of this century. And they were so successful and so prosperous, they got together and they wrote a book about themselves called Leading Afro-Americans of Vicksburg, Mississippi, 1908. So we know who they were, we know what they had, we know what they were doing. We've lost all of that in 100 years or more. So the history, something must be wrong with that air conditioner. The history is here, and you know, it needs to be told, it needs to be retold, but more than anything, we need houses like this all over Vicksburg, all over wherever you are. We need them. There is an area not far from here called Freetown, which is full of beautiful homes, perhaps $1 million homes that blacks occupy, if not $1 million homes close to it. They don't even know, and it has never occurred to them to wonder why that particular area of town with all these beautiful houses that they live in and have their beautiful cars in these beautiful driveways, they don't know, they can't tell you why it's called Freetown. And it's called Freetown because that was the area where the freed slaves followed the Union troops into Vicksburg before the fall of the Confederacy in 1863. And the first settlement that freed blacks set up here in Vicksburg was out in that area that they called Freetown. And it's called that to this day. And the people who are living there don't know it, don't know the reason why. That's sinful. That's sinful. Right out there in Freetown. That's where they came. July 4th. When I was growing up, July 4th, black people celebrated, but it wasn't celebrating our liberation from England. It was celebrating the fact that the Confederacy had fallen on July 4th, 1863. And one of the great ironies of history, on the very same date that the Declaration of Independence was signed, gaining our independence from England, not 100 years later, on that same date, July 4th, the Confederacy fell in Vicksburg. The Union troops won. Blacks were liberated. Now, the war went on for 2 more years after that because it didn't end until 1865. But the Confederacy fell on July 4th, 1863. When we celebrated, when black folks celebrated July 4th, that's what they were celebrating. They told us that. They knew that. And they'd say, yes, child, yeah, all that they tell you in school, you go ahead, you learn that, that's fine. But the real reason we celebrate July 4th, no, I'm 70 years old. Who's going to tell the children that when I'm gone? So, this is the value of the Jacqueline House to us. We have more recent stories, we have more recent history, we have the artwork of black artists, we have a collection of long ago black music, the blues and jazz, we have degrees, we have Baroque. Yay, Baroque. And I shudder to think that in the midterm elections in 23, 22 days, the same people who came and voted for Barack to be president, they're not going to vote. They're going to stay at home because they're going to say, well, it's not a presidential election. And they will not realize that by staying at home, they will be paralyzing this man and what he can do for the next 2 years and possibly the next 6 years. Because, see, we're still tied to that celebrity thing, We want somebody rich and famous, and then we will turn out and applaud for them and get in front of the camera and shake their hands and everything. You want to see Barack? Okay, thank you. I'll turn Barack around. We would vote for the first black president of the United States, but we will not vote for the people that he needs to support him. Because we are so tied into the celebrity thing, We want to vote for the big thing, but the little thing that really makes the difference, the midterm elections, we won't turn out for. We won't vote for. We won't learn. This is the house of your ancestors. We used to say when we'd go out to Beulah Cemetery, we used to say, everybody in Vicksburg, which is probably true, that everybody who's living in Vicksburg has somebody buried out at Beulah, which was the black cemetery, before we could bury in the city cemetery. Blacks, if they weren't buried in church cemeteries, were buried in Beulah Cemetery. And most blacks in this city couldn't get to Beulah now if their lives depended on it. Don't know where it is. Straight out what used to be called Old Jackson Road, Openwood Street, this diagonal street right out here, you just go right on out, and at a certain point there's going to be a cut where the road ends. And to the left, it goes on around Park. To the right, it goes off into what it says will be a dead end. You follow that dead end road, you stay to the right, and you'll come right on up Beulah Cemetery. Topographically, that cemetery is the most beautiful cemetery in Vicksburg. We have let it go down. Leo Sims, who is 80 years old, is doing a one-man job of keeping that grass cut and keeping it going. There's almost no more space in Beulah Cemetery, but you go out there and the hills, the trees that make kind of like a natural valley, it's the most beautiful cemetery in Vicksburg. And we've let it go. And in large part we let it go, when we could start burying our relatives out in the city cemetery along with everybody else, we let that cemetery go.
Now, most of our folks are buried in Gumwood Cemetery.
I don't know where that is.
Gumwood Cemetery is in back of, off of Bovina Cutoff.
I know where that is.
And Willie Irv's,
Right.
Irv's home.
Yes.
It's in back of there. And we want to get out there because we have never been in the grave site, and we want to get out there and try to document what's left of it, the grave.
Oh, yes.
And they have some markers, they say. So we plan on trying to come back in December.
Uh-huh.
And when the Irv's family, usually after Christmas, the day after, they used to go out there and clean the grave site out.
Uh-huh.
The debris and other things.
Right.
And so
Right.
we're going to try to do what we can to get out there.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
But I've never heard the name.
Gumwood Cemetery.
I'll make it my business to go there to find out where it is.
Okay.
I really will.
And when we get the information and get the pictures, we'll give you a catalog of what's out there.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah, because we want to try to keep it as much as possible and
Keep
share it.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our great, 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 and great grandfather and grandfather. No, great, great grandfather and great, great grandfather buried up.
Are buried up there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you need to do everything that you can to maintain that and to record it.
We talked about it yesterday with a relative, the family, the Herbs family.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother was the Herbs.
All right. Reverend Herbs just died, right?
Right.
I saw that in the paper.
My grandmother's brother.
That's your grandmother's brother.
Yeah. And their father, John Herbs, he owned over 300 acres at one time, correct?
It was quite a bit.
Yeah.
He had like 16 black families living on it.
On that acreage of land, that's amazing. That's amazing. And that they did that, they could accumulate that, save, buy what they wanted to, and you never knew where that money was coming from. You know, you would just go and say, well, you know, I can't do this or I can't do that because I don't have the money. And some old lady in the family would say, turn around, boy. And you had to turn around so she could go in her blouse and pull out this little bag, and pull out a bag with rolls of $100 bills in it, you know. It's just amazing.
And we thank you so much for taking the time out and giving us this knowledge of Vicksburg.
I am so glad that you came.
Yeah.
I really am. And the place is always open to you and your family. If I'm not able to come here, I can just come and open the door, and you all can come and stay and look over at everything and stay as long as you like.
Yeah. And you remember I told you I dreamed about this place before I came here.
Yeah, I remember.
And it was more than what I dreamed of.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm so glad.
And you said you wouldn't want to scan it in the picture.
Well, what pictures do you want to scan?
Oh, we haven't.
No.
We haven't. Whatever we would like, we would confront you first.
Okay,
Yeah.
no, that would be fine.
Yeah.
We were all skeptical. Someone put up that no cameras allowed inside the museum, because one time, I think it was about 12 years ago, this man came from up north somewhere, and he actually brought a little portable Xerox machine with him, you know, and he wanted to Xerox everything we had in the house. He just wanted to sit at the table and, you know, the papers or, you know, the books, everything he wanted to Xerox. And Tillman said, oh no, we can't do that, you know. But
I'm kind of like him, but I understand.
Anything that you want to scan, that would be fine.
Okay, yeah, but we would definitely confront you before we're going to respect this place.
Well, I appreciate that so much.
Okay.
And you would have full and free access to what you wanted.
Okay.
Anytime I let that man take the Tom Woods collection away for a week,
Okay.
you know my people can come in here
Yeah, okay.
and do what they want.
Okay.
I want to show you, I didn't call your attention, I wanted to show you, this is our latest acquisition here. A lady has had this birdhouse. Isn't that exquisite? I would love to live in this house myself. But she had this birdhouse since she was a little girl, and she gave it to us. I think she had a parrot or something. Hey, Nolan.
Hey,
Come on in.
I was just looking for you.
Okay, I'm here. Fellas, this is Nolan Smith. He's my manager and the funeral director. Former Marine? Okay. I once said ex-Marine, and he had probably had an apoplectic stroke.
I just was checking on things, seeing everything's okay.
Yeah, nothing came yesterday, though.
Okay, all right, just checking. I was out at the house making sure that everything's kind of stabilized for Monday.
Okay, everything all right for Monday? How's Augusta doing?
Fine.
Is she? Okay. All right, well, maybe that internet connection will be here on Monday.
Okay.
But the most important thing is for her to be doing all right, for her to be doing fine.
She's fine. I think I'm more nervous than she is.
I'm sure you are. I'm sure.
I was by here and was checking on that.
Okay, thank you, Nolan. Thank you. I have to go down to Verdi's at 4 o'clock, and then I'm going from there to Mass. But I will transfer the calls when I leave. Okay, thanks a lot. But at any rate, someone had given her this birdhouse when she was a little girl, and now she's in her 80s or 90s, and she gave it to us. Isn't that lovely?
Yeah.
I told her, I said, I wouldn't mind living in that house myself. She had a little bird and perches that used to be in there. But I want you to see before you go. Oh, and this is Mrs. Irma Dees. This is Mrs. Dees. She was my 3rd grade teacher. This was her picture many years ago. All the boys were crazy about her. She was so beautiful. And when she got married, they hated her husband with a visceral dislike. Miss Dees called me. She died last month in September. But Miss Dees called me. She called me on the telephone when she was 93 years old. And she said, Yolande, I lost my driver's license and I can't find it anywhere. She said, and I know it's against the law for me to drive without my driver's license. So she said, you better come so I can get a duplicate. I said, okay. And I knew that her license was expiring later on, not too far into the future because it was her birthday. I knew her license was expiring. So I said, okay, God will take care of her. He does this. He'll take care of her for the next month or so. So I took her down to the driving facility, and she was dressed so snappishly. She was 93 years old. And they were asking her these questions, and she was just whipping off the answers. I mean, just like that. And the policeman said, he said, well, Mrs. Dees, he said, your license expires next month anyway. Why don't you just renew it for the next 4 years? And I'm standing there looking like, will you please look at the woman's age? And she said, oh, can I do that? He said, yes, ma'am. It's $20. She whipped out that $20 bill, got her license renewed. And 2 years later, when she had to go into the nursing home, she was the only resident in any nursing home in this city who had a perfectly valid driver's license at the age of 98. She died when she was 102, 10 days shy of 102 years old. Mrs. Irma Dees is her. I would say of everything in this house, this is probably my favorite picture or piece. This is the 1909 graduating class of class of 1909 of McIntyre, Bowman High School. McIntyre, 1909 graduating class, and they all look like movie stars, don't they?
Mm-hmm. It looked more like a ball that had been there.
Then graduates. And the relative, these two are teachers. These two are the class sponsors. And the relative of one of these on the picture here had kept her grandmother's identification of all of these people so we know who all of them are. And this one was Professor McIntyre, and this one was Professor Bowman. Class of 1909. Professor Bowman and Professor McIntyre.
And one of my family of an undertaker, is that correct? The footy or?
Foots?
Yeah.
Now, I don't know about the Foots being related to an undertaker. They may have been. Jefferson was the first.
There's some on our documents that's got foot that took care of the burial. I have to show it to you.
Okay, all right, because I'm not familiar with
Okay.
that. I know that the Dillon Funeral Home began. Charles Dillon, I think it was Charles Dillon, owned the largest store. And eventually he branched out into selling insurance. He sold insurance for the other funeral homes. And then Dillon, that business eventually became converted into Dillon Funeral Home. But originally it was Jefferson, and then it was my family, and then it was Dillon. Now, I know Foote was a dentist. There was a Foote who was a dentist, and he was one of the founders of the local NAACP here. But I didn't know about this connection. Please, let me have that information, because I didn't know that. Let me know that information. I didn't know. But this, see, we haven't even gotten into some of the educational papers. Look at these children here. Look at them. You can tell some of them, like the little boy with the high starched collar and the tie right there. You can tell he was well-to-do. Or the boy at the top, the third from the right, he looks like a little dandy. But you look at some of the other children, it looks like they had to maybe borrow a coat from someone to take their class photograph. But isn't that beautiful? My. Yes. So every time I come into this house, my pride gets reawakened again. And that lady over there, she's a relative of mine. She was in with my mother's pictures, and I put her over here. My mother told me who she was, but I can't remember how far back she goes. But I thought that she was the perfect protector of this house, you know, because it looks like she's saying, all right, you all can come into this house, but you better behave yourselves, you know. And so I thought, okay, Mama, she's our protector. I like to say she's the owner of the house.
Who's the plumber who had
The what?
the plumber and the picture on top of it as well?
Rosa A. Temple High School. I don't know. You have to read the name. I've forgotten who it was. We have some other diplomas too from various high schools that we need to put up. And this was a gift from Ghana in Africa. One of the young men from Africa came here and studied to be a priest and was ordained in May of this year. And he brought that piece back from Ghana and presented it to the Jacqueline House. He said, this is called the Council of the Elders. And the tradition is whatever the dispute or the argument is in the village, these elders get together and they stay locked in community and in union until the dispute is settled, until they come to an agreement. And then the village is bound to accept what they have decided. But that the council of the elders, nobody gets up and stomps off, nobody, walks away. They stay locked. Metaphorically, they stay locked.
And we recently found out that he got his DNA done, and our bloodline comes from one of our bloodlines comes from the region of Ghana.
Of Ghana.
Yeah, and in our spirit, as family and brothers, we always want to kind of go by what they're talking about, our elders, and we try to live. We try to live. We haven't really been taught that in words, but
And by actions.
in actions, we try to live that way. And it's a good thing that you just told us that, because it opens another door for us.
That's wonderful.
Right.
Yeah.
That is so wonderful. And you're right, that is a lesson that we all need to learn.
Yeah.
Because disagreements are real, and compromise is real and genuine. But if you are determined to stay locked in union, and most especially in love, you know, and say, we are going to stay here until this is settled, and everyone will agree to it. That's a wonderful attitude to have. And whoever did that sculpture, it was a villager, you know. Whoever did that was just
Locked in union.
locked in union.
Almost like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
Exactly. I hadn't thought of that, but you're exactly right. And see, you all probably have never seen this. This went with my bike. When you got a new bike at Christmas or on your birthday, this was your own private pump so that you pumped up your tires. Get out there and pump up your tires. It's almost like a piece of furniture, isn't it? It was typical. Came with your bike.
Where'd you hook it up at?
Hooked it up. I don't know. It's always worked. There's a little hole there and the air comes out.
Push it in there.
Pushing it, yeah.
They did.
Yeah.
Do you know who invented that? Or
I don't know who invented that.
Okay.
No. I know it was part of a bike that I got. You know. It's part of a
Okay.
My parents were very generous people, but they were also very disciplined. My mother would always say at Christmas time, she would say, now you may get 3 things. And, you know, I always got 1 or 2 extra things that were a surprise. You know, we did. But the 6th floor, I think it was the 6th floor down at the Valley, and the other places, you know, were filled with toys. And she would say, no, you can choose 3 things. And I knew that was the rule. And it was such an invaluable lesson because you learned to choose. You know, you learned you couldn't have everything that you wanted, and you learned to choose. And she never went over that rule. I could choose 3 things. And, you know, I would get those 3 things, and then, as I say, 1 or 2 surprises. But just, you know, you see kids fall out when they can't have something, you know, and have temper tantrums and whatever. And it was not that. It was just, you know, an understanding. You can have 3 things. So
I'm trying to get all the information I can of Vicksburg, the black experience in Vicksburg. I can. Now, is there anything on this that you already have that someone gave to you that they got stuff documented that I could retrieve real quick? And
no, I don't. None of this is on a. We want to get it on a disc right now.
Okay.
But there's nothing that I can give you right now. However, when we are finished with it, when I do, if you give me your name and address and where I can reach you, I'll make sure you get that disc.
Okay.
All right.
And then I would love to be a part of when you get ready to document and scan. I'm the perfect person for you to do that because that's all I do. Is try to document stuff and scan it. And so if I can come down there and help you a week or 2, let me know. And my brother and I would be more than glad to.
That would be wonderful.
You know, just, you know, take a little burden off of you.
And your courage.
Yeah, and because I know what it means to me to be able to see the information. And I know what it means to us to share it with others, our next generation.
That would
And we would be at your disposal, and you can run it the way you run it, not us coming in doing.
That would be wonderful. That would be wonderful. I'm going to get. I have 2 minutes to keep paper in here. I'm going to see if there's.
It's been amazing to me already.
Yeah.
I mean,
just relax. And I wasn't expecting that.
yeah, I wasn't expecting what I see today.
Now, whose shoes are those?
Well, actually, nobody let me know. We got those shoes from a shoe store that was going out of business here in Vicksburg called Sage's Bootery downtown. And those shoes looked so much like the shoes of ladies in these pictures that we have over there, we asked them, you know, what are you going to do with those shoes? And they wanted to know why. And we told them, we said, we have pictures in our museum of so many women wearing shoes like that. And they gave it to us.
You know whose shoes they look like? The first black lady pilot that went to France.
Oh, yes.
That's why I asked.
Yes, right. And I can't call her name right now. Oh, goodness, we used to talk about her all the
She's
time.
buried in Chicago.
That's right.
They used to have a flyover every year. I
can't, you know, we've got her picture here, too. Oh, gosh. What is that lady's name? Yeah, you know that's going to worry me until it comes to me. It really will.
I got her name. Let me see.
And see, I remember how those fountains were different downtown, and there was divided space in the ice cream shops. There was a sign with a hand like this, and it pointed and said colored this way, and white went in straight ahead. And I remember, you know, my mother, before we went to town to do any shopping or anything, she'd say, all right, now get your water and go to the bathroom, because you're not going to drink any water, you know, from that fountain, or go in the bathrooms downtown.
What would happen if a black person or a colored person would drink water from that fountain?
Oh, they'd get beat up. They'd get beat up if they were lucky. You didn't dare drink from a white fountain.
You say if they were lucky.
If they were lucky, because they might get killed. They could very easily get killed.
Just from drinking?
Just from drinking, yeah. You were inferior. You were second rate. There was no effort ever to clean or to repair. If the water fountain needed repair, you drank entirely and exclusively out of the colored fountain, and you wouldn't dare go to get a drink of water from the white fountain. The buses here were segregated as well. You sat in the back of the bus, and sometimes there was a partition, you know, or a divider that separated the black section, which was always smaller in terms of the number of seats that it contained than the white section was. And if whites needed the seats where you were sitting, they would keep moving that partition back. And that was normal practice. It was normal practice. And I never went to an integrated school. I left here because my mother was ill, but I left here and went to Chicago when I was 11 years old, and essentially stayed there until I came home again in 1984. I mean, I would always come home, you know, for Christmas and summer and all of the holidays, but I stayed in school and lived in Chicago.
Yeah, we live just outside of Chicago.
Where?
Aurora, Illinois.
Oh, I know Aurora very well.
Okay.
Yes, I do. I lived on the south side of Chicago in projects that are no longer there, the Ida B. Wells
Yes, ma'am.
projects.
On State Street.
On South Parkway.
Right.
Well, it's now King Drive, but our address was 3743 South Parkway back then. Apartment 158, Kenwood 83251 was our phone number.
I could have sworn they had some Ida B. Wells
They may have.
on State Street, but I could be wrong too.
They may have. They may. I love Chicago. I always have. My grandmother used to say you could be decently poor and have a nice life in Chicago. And it's true. They would give me $3, sometimes $4 on Saturday. And, you know, this was when I was a teenager. And I could be gone all day, but I had to be home before dark. And, you know, you would take the L and go downtown and go to the Art Institute, and $3 or $4 you could get a nice meal for yourself, and yeah, and they didn't worry about people molesting you or anything like that. And so I did that every Saturday for years.
Do you remember the lounge that the Muddy Waters and B.B. King and Howlin' Wolf used to play at? I think it was on.
Now I remember the Club de Lisa. The Club de Lisa. It was on 47th or 46th and what? It wasn't South Parkway because I remember the Regal Theater, and the Club de Lisa. And then as I got to be an older teenager, we started frequenting, the places up and around Rush Street.
Oh, okay.
The Gate of Horn in the old hotel, I've forgotten. The old hotel. That'll come to me too. But in the basement of that hotel was the Gate of Horn. And that's where I saw an afro for the first time. Odetta, back in the 1950s, was wearing an afro. And then I used to go to a club out 43rd Street where Junior Wells used to perform. Looked like a bombed out section of Chicago back then. But that was on 43rd Street. But what I remember, I'm a great jazz lover. I'm a jazz fanatic. And part of that came, see, people couldn't do this anymore. When I was in high school, out on 63rd Street, out there were some juke joints. People who had not yet become famous were playing out there. We'd go out there after school. And many times the musicians were setting up for performances that night. And the barkeep, nobody could do this anymore. This is why I really treasure my life so much. The barkeep took a look at us one day and he said, "You kids want to come in?" And we said, "Yeah," And he said, "Okay." And the musicians were setting up, and they would play sets for us, if you can imagine. The barkeep kept feeding us Coca-Colas, and along about 6 o'clock he'd say, "All right, you kids, you got to go home now. Do your homework. It's time for the grown-ups." And we would have to leave there, but like from 4 till 6 or 6:30, we would be sitting up in some joint, 15, 16 years old, listening to Miles Davis and John Coltrane, and all those guys. We would be sitting there drinking Coke, talking to them. We would make Miles so mad because he knew that things were changing, and we would all go to hear Train and his solos. Train was just doing unbelievable things on his sax, and we would sit there, and we couldn't wait for Train to do his solos, and Miles would get mad and stomp off the stage. I guess we knew even then that things were changing in the music as well as in what was going on in the country. But you couldn't even, nobody would risk their license letting a group of teenagers into a bar, and yet taking care of them, making sure that they didn't do anything that was inappropriate, and they could drink Coca-Colas, they could listen to the music, and then when the proprietor said, "You gotta go," we had to go, But I mean, music that people were paying good money for, we would sit up there in the afternoon and listen to for free.
Quite an experience.
That was quite an experience. That really was. I mean, we knew that it was special to be able to get into, a joint, but it was in the afternoon, so it didn't seem that special to us. But, from looking back on it from 50 years, it was extraordinary. That really was. So, we heard some of the greatest jazz that you could imagine at that time. But I will always remember that man. I can't remember his name. He started looking at his watch and he said, all right, it's time for homework. You kids go home.
You remember the Riverside Cafe?
I remember the Riverside Cafe. Yes, I do.
How segregated it was.
Mm-hmm.
As a kid, I can remember going in, and whites was on this side, and the blacks was on this side, and I'm not for certain, but I even think that the waitress was segregated too. I'm not for sure whether the black waitresses served the white customer.
Yeah, yeah.
But I do remember the waiter would come up with, waitress would come up with some money, and they had a cigar box, and they would lay it on that cigar box, and if I'm not mistaken, they'd step back until he put that change down.
That's right.
And then he would come, she would come and pick it up and bring it back to him.
That's right. I remember that. I remember that very well.
Yeah.
And I was a young kid.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So, I could probably ask this, maybe start off with maybe the oldest photos that maybe if you got them in a book or something. And I came here one time and you had a relative in a yearbook, and she was from a Catholic school here in Vicksburg. And I never did get to retrieve that photo or anything, but I remember seeing it in like a yearbook. A Catholic school, and here in Vicksburg.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, my sister would have been, my father went to Catholic school. My sister would have been, the only one of my generation who went to Catholic school. Now, I have a lot of pictures on the computer, some of them from here. And so I may have the picture that you're talking about on the computer. And there's also a picture. My sister was fluent in German.
Okay. His son speaks fluently German.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Your son speaks German?
Yeah.
Man, that's wonderful, isn't it? How did he learn German?
Well, he learned German in school, and then he went abroad to Germany. He did a exchange student in Germany, and so that's why he enhanced his ability to speak German.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
That's grand.
Yeah.
I mean, there just seems to be, sort of a natural affinity. I remember probably, even though I had heard the N-word, many times from white people, probably the first race word that I really remember being bothered by was kraut. Because there were all German nuns down at St. Mary's. There was one Irish nun. And one year she was teaching us how to do the Irish jig for St. Patrick's Day. We were all learning how to. And a group of us wanted her to go and get the Superior, Mother Superior, the Sister Superior, to come and join the dance, do the Irish jig with us. And this Irish nun, Sister Bertranda was her name, she said, oh, no. She said, we don't want that. No, she said, she's a kraut. And those krauts don't know anything about dancing. We don't want any krauts spoiling our dance. And I had never heard that word. Couldn't wait until the end of the school day. And I came home. My dad was making arrangements with somebody for a funeral, with a family for a funeral. And I ran into the house. I said, Daddy, what's a kraut? And his face didn't drop. It catapulted, because he could not imagine where I had picked. This was after World War II. So, he would have known what kraut was. I mean, everybody was calling Italians Dagos and, all of that. And
Italians.
Dagos.
Okay.
Dago was the race word, and we had been told, not to use that word, and kraut was something entirely new, And my father couldn't imagine where I had picked up that word. And so I told him quickly because I sensed I was going to be in trouble, you know. And I said, that's what the nun called the other nun down here. And he told me, he said, kraut is a word that hurts people. He said sometimes people use it to mean Germans, just like people use the word nigger to mean black folks. And he said, or Negroes, that was the term back then. And he said, you should not ever use that word. And that's really the first race word, you know, that I remember hearing somebody else use with some, and the Irish nuns said, no, we don't want those krauts in here. They don't know anything about dancing. And she was living at home in the convent with them, you know, eating and sleeping with them.
I have never heard that.
You never heard the word kraut?
Uh-uh.
The offensive, yeah. I think it's supposed to be